At 4:47 on a Friday morning, while most of Britain still slept beneath winter darkness, Buckingham Palace released a statement so devastatingly final that even seasoned royal correspondents, accustomed to parsing careful language and diplomatic phrasing, found themselves staring at their screens in stunned disbelief. His Majesty the King's medical team has advised that treatment is no longer effective. The King is receiving end-of-life care at Windsor Castle. The royal family has been informed and is gathering at His Majesty's bedside. 29 words, no softening, no false hope, just the brutal truth that King Charles III, who had waited 7 decades to wear the crown and had worn it for barely 3 years, was dying. The statement. The announcement came without warning, without the graduated series of health bulletins that typically prepare a nation for royal death. One moment the official line remained that the King was receiving ongoing treatment, managing his condition and maintaining limited duties. The next moment the palace confirmed what everyone had feared, but no one had been willing to voice. Charles was in his final hours and there would be no recovery, no miraculous improvement, no gentle decline that might grant his family years instead of days. BBC interrupted its early morning programming within seconds of the statement's release, the presenter's voice catching slightly as she read the words aloud to a nation that would wake to find its second Elizabethan age had ended, and something new, uncertain, and infinitely sadder had begun. Sky News activated its full morning protocols, graphics already prepared for this moment appearing on screens with a speed that felt almost obscene, and in the United States, where it was still late Thursday night, CNN's breaking news alert cut through primetime programming with a starkness that made even American anchors accustomed to royal drama pause and gather themselves before speaking. Outside Windsor Castle, the first mourners began arriving before sunrise, appearing like ghosts in the pre-dawn darkness, drawn by grief they couldn't fully articulate and a need to be present for history they'd hoped wouldn't arrive so soon. An elderly woman who had waited in line for 15 hours to view Queen Elizabeth's coffin stood now at the gates with tears streaming down her face. "He barely had any time," she whispered to no one in particular. "He waited his whole life and they gave him barely any time at all." Inside Kensington Palace, William had been awake since 3:30, having spent a sleepless night after receiving a call from Windsor's senior physician warning that Charles's condition had deteriorated dramatically. The official palace statement confirmed what that private call had prepared him for, but reading the words in stark black text on his phone screen made it real in a way the late-night medical update hadn't. His father was dying, not theoretically, not eventually, but now, today, within hours, perhaps minutes. Catherine found him standing at the window of his study, still in the clothes he'd worn the previous day, staring out at darkness that had not yet yielded to dawn. She didn't ask if he was all right, the question would have been absurd. Instead, she simply stood beside him, her hand finding his, offering the only comfort possible when comfort itself felt inadequate. "The children," William said finally, his voice roughed from tears he'd shed in private. "They need to say goodbye, George especially. He's old enough to understand, old enough to regret it forever if we don't let him." Catherine nodded, already mentally preparing for the impossible task of waking their children before sunrise to tell them their grandfather was dying, that they needed to leave immediately, that this might be the last time they saw him alive. "I'll wake them," she said softly. "You call ahead. Let Windsor know we're coming." Within 20 minutes, the Wales family was in a convoy racing through empty London streets toward Windsor, accompanied by protection officers who understood the urgency well enough to push speed limits that would normally be inviolable. George sat in silence, staring through tinted windows at a city that looked foreign in the pre-dawn darkness. Charlotte cried quietly, her face pressed against Catherine's shoulder, and Louis, too young to fully grasp the permanence of what was coming, simply held his mother's hand and asked repeatedly when they would arrive. At Windsor, Princess Anne had been present through the night, having never left after receiving the initial call about Charles's deterioration. She had watched her brother slip in and out of consciousness, had held his hand during moments of lucidity when he seemed to recognize her, and had stood witness as the medical team gradually acknowledged what they'd been avoiding. There was nothing more to be done. Treatment had failed. The cancer had won, and all that remained was managing pain and allowing the king whatever dignity could be preserved in death. Camilla had not left Charles's side since the previous afternoon, when his breathing had become labored and his periods of wakefulness grew shorter and more confused. She sat beside his bed, holding his hand, speaking to him softly even when he couldn't respond, maintaining presence, because presence was all she had left to offer. The queen consort, who had fought so hard to stand beside him, who had weathered decades of public criticism to reach this position, now faced the cruelest irony of all. She would lose him before they'd barely begun the reign they'd waited so long to share. As dawn broke over Windsor Castle, painting the ancient stones in shades of pink and gold that felt obscenely beautiful given what was happening inside, the royal family assembled for the vigil every family dreads but none can avoid: the waiting, the watching, the unbearable passage of time when someone you love is dying and all you can do is be present for the leaving, the final decline. To understand how the palace reached this moment of devastating finality, we must return to 72 hours earlier when Charles's condition, though serious, still carried the possibility of stabilization. The medical team led by Dr. Sarah Chin and supported by specialists from across Europe had been managing his cancer treatment with aggressive interventions that bought time but extracted brutal costs. But on Tuesday afternoon, during what should have been a routine checkup, the monitoring equipment revealed something alarming. Charles's organ function was declining far more rapidly than predicted. The cancer, which had seemed contained, had metastasized in ways the imaging hadn't detected. What they'd been treating as manageable had transformed into something acute and irreversible. The medical team convened an emergency consultation. Dr. Chin presented the findings with clinical precision, but everyone understood what the data meant. They were no longer managing chronic illness. They were now facing end-stage disease. Professor Michael Hartley, the senior oncologist, spoke the words no one else wanted to voice. We need to discuss palliative care. We need to prepare the family for the possibility that we're looking at days, not weeks or months. That evening, Dr. Chin sat down with Charles to explain that the treatment was no longer working, that his body was failing despite their best efforts, and that the time had come to shift focus from cure to comfort. Charles listened with composure that broke her heart, asking technical questions about timelines and symptoms. How long? He asked finally, his voice steady. Days, perhaps a week if we're fortunate. The decline will likely be rapid once it begins in earnest. Charles nodded slowly. I need to speak with William. There are things that must be said, arrangements that must be made, constitutional matters that cannot wait for sentiment. That conversation occurred late Tuesday night behind closed doors. Those present reported hearing raised voices followed by long silences followed by unmistakable weeping. When William finally emerged nearly 2 hours later, his face was ravaged by tears, his composure completely shattered. He collapsed into Catherine's arms with grief so raw that even hardened protection officers had to look away. By Wednesday morning, Charles's decline had accelerated visibly. He remained conscious but increasingly confused, drifting between present awareness and disoriented states. Camilla noticed how his grip on her hand had weakened, how his responses grew delayed and sometimes nonsensical. The medical team confirmed the cancer had begun affecting his neurological function. Wednesday afternoon brought the first true crisis. Charles experienced what the medical team carefully termed an acute episode. His heart had briefly stopped, requiring emergency intervention. The doctor stabilized him, but Dr. Chin took Camilla aside and explained with devastating gentleness that these episodes would become more frequent, that eventually one would occur they couldn't reverse, that the time to gather family was now. Thursday was marked by long stretches of unconsciousness interrupted by brief periods of confused wakefulness. During one lucid moment, Charles asked for Anne, who came immediately. Tell William, he managed. Tell him it's not a burden, it's a gift. Tell him I was proud every day. And gripped his hand, tears streaming down her face, and promised she would. By Thursday evening, Charles had entered what the medical team called the active dying phase. His breathing became labored and irregular. His periods of consciousness grew shorter and further apart. His body was finally surrendering. Dr. Chin, her voice thick with emotion, made the call to the communications team. Prepare the statement. The king was dying and the nation needed to be told. The statement was released at 4:47 Friday morning, time to reach early news programs, allowing the nation to wake to the truth rather than face it suddenly. And as Britain stirred into consciousness, the royal family gathered at Windsor to bear witness to an ending no amount of preparation could make bearable. A family assembles. The emergency summons went out at 3:32 Friday morning, carefully coded messages that nevertheless carried unmistakable urgency. Come immediately, final hours, no delays. The palace had prepared protocols for exactly this scenario, but nothing captured the human weight of waking people before dawn to tell them someone they loved was dying. William had been awake already, unable to sleep. When his phone rang with the distinctive tone reserved for palace emergencies, he'd known before answering what the call would tell him. How long?